You know what? I wasn't sure how to start off this commentary, so I figured it would be smartest to play Heaton's apology towards me.
I also want to apologize to Ephrom. While I still think the way things were handled in that situation was wrong, it was also wrong of me to take a drive-by shot at you as I left the community, more so that I never corrected the record. I was going off the words of people who assured me they were there and had the whole story. I'm sorry, Ephrom, you didn't deserve it. Should have been more thorough in my research of the situation and not acted out of immediate outrage. It was a fucked up thing to do, and I'm working on prioritizing my reactivity problems.
Now, I wish to be clear that if Hiten is genuinely getting better regarding their issues, that is very commendable. I am not going to mock that or deride that in any way. The problem is, the events they're describing didn't happen. For those who don't know, Hiten is talking about a video they made called Goodbye SCC. They have since taken it down, however, a re-upload of it is available on YouTube. And in said video, they lob several criticisms my way, which I will get to. Now, the only person in that video they show any evidence is a source for me is Fractured Light. I know that wasn't their only source, however, to my knowledge, any other sources they've had have remained anonymous. Let's look at some of the DMs from Light that Hiten showed in that video and see if you notice what I notice. Yeah, when he found out I had, they said, next time you're gonna check with me if that's okay, something along those lines. I think V's inactive speedrun account, the fact Sigma Scott 4, Pokesonic's groomer, has a Snapchat, doll claiming Junkie told him and Laka about Spocter's flash drive, and nothing else to my memory, but that's only to memory. I think I told her. I'll double check. I think so? Like, if Ephrom found out I told her, I think he'd consider it a rule break, but I don't think he knows I did that. Light's messages were full of him saying that he personally did not know if what he was claiming to Hiten was 100% accurate. The idea that Light was saying that he had the full story was entirely incorrect. But okay, at the very least, Hiten apologized. I will give them that. In the same video where they insult the community I'm a part of and have been a part of for several years and have been constantly working to try and improve, before a minute passes,
in the echo chamber that was the SCC, I had those beliefs confirmed and enabled by the people around me.
Also, I just need to highlight this real quick.
I realize now that this community has been full of hypocrisy and snakes from the very beginning. I believed that there were good people here and that we were worth the work, but I no longer believe that.
You're sorry to me, but also the community I'm in is exclusively made up of bad people and snakes. Wouldn't that include me, by the way? Like, logically?
For all of Susie's gripes with cancel culture, the Cloud Palace and the SCC as a whole were some of the biggest perpetrators of it.
In what context exactly? Especially given you yourself covered a situation that was directly about people not cutting ties with somebody as abhorrent as the fucking Omega. Wouldn't a community obsessed with cancel culture also be one that kicks people like that out so fast that nobody would even consider hanging around with them, just based on what that term means? And I wish to be absolutely clear, I am not saying that Hiten cannot criticize the SCC. I'm confused as to why they would make such statements in a video where they're apologizing to, among others, somebody in the SCC, that being yours truly. And this video is full of accusations against a very good friend of mine, that being Lio Convoy. The claims are entirely unsubstantiated, by the way. Hiten shows absolutely no evidence for anything they say at any point in this video, truth be told. Seriously, the entire video is just Hiten talking over this image. Never once do they show any screenshots or any video clips or anything to actually back up what they are saying. And this wouldn't even bother me so much if it weren't for the fact that very serious claims were being thrown Lyo's way all throughout basically the entire last half hour of Hiten's video. And I want to be clear, when I say these claims are serious, I'm referring to Hiten saying Lyo falsely accused them of abuse and damaged their mental health in very severe ways. I am not even going to bother responding to these accusations against Lyo because regardless of what I personally think of them, there's just nothing to discuss. She says things that she alleges happened, but doesn't actually provide any proof for anything. None of this is even getting into the already established running point throughout this video that the SCC was just horribly toxic, and that's one of the main reasons why Hiten was like this, or at the very least the SCC enabled already existing toxic traits within them. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like the SCC has always been perfect. No community has been. However, I want to point out real quick that two of the biggest community-wide callouts the past year, the ones done by Rin and Chuli, were specifically about Hiten and their friend circle. I'm not going to pretend the community was peaceful and all of that before Hiten showed up. That would be ridiculous. However, I find this framing so problematic because, to be blunt, it's not as if Hiten were some low-level member of the community who got swept up in their bad habits. Hiten was one of the top dogs. Hiten was also not some small-time player in a lot of these problems. Hiten was at the center of them. By the way, where exactly was your mention of Kami? You know, the person who you misrepresented the grooming story of without their permission in order to get a shot in at me? Kami already did their own video going into that if you would like to watch it. Safi, one of the people who Hiten apologized to, also made a full video going into her problems with what was said. And Rin, a different person who Hiten apologized to in this video, also wrote a Google document responding to what Hiten said. Lyo also responded to several of the accusations against him on Hidden Heroine's stream recently. Chuli was also present on that stream, who's another person that Hiten apologized to that also doesn't forgive them. Anyway, it's probably a smart idea to finally cover the Goodbye SCC video. Funnily enough, I was already planning on doing a full commentary on it when Hiten's video dropped, so this served as extra incentive.
This was a video I hoped I'd never make. However, I think I've hit a wall that I'm quite frankly done trying to climb over. I've been in this community a while now, and I've seen trends up and down. However, I'm watching people make the same mistakes and do the same things that cracked the foundation of the community in half.
One of the most obnoxious things about this video is Hiten's reliance on Barnum statements. For those who don't know, Barnum statements are essentially sentences that sound very unique and personalized to you, but in truth are incredibly general and could apply to a variety of situations. The first half of Hiten's video is chocked full, jam-packed, filled to the fucking brim with Barnum statements. Because of that, I cannot respond to a good chunk of this video because so much of it fails to actually make coherent sense. I'm pretty sure I know what's being discussed, but I say pretty sure because the details given are so vague that I honestly am not certain. And normally I can think of at the very least one other situation it could be applied to, but also I'm not omnipresent within the SCC. It's perfectly possible there's a situation Hiten was referencing that I just wasn't involved with. Now, Hiten does say at a couple points the main reason they aren't giving specifics is because they were asked not to by those involved.
There's been more than one incident, but I consulted the people slighted, and they didn't want me to name names. So I won't, and if you know who you are, I ask that you don't, and we let things sit, I guess.
But if you're forced to keep things so general that it is genuinely impossible to figure out what you are talking about, then what the fuck was the point of vague posting like this in the first place?
There's a few things to blame for this. The first is the bullheaded unwillingness the community has to stand up for one another. We are supposed to support and take care of one another, but in recent months and in multiple situations, y'all will claim support behind the scenes, but say nothing and do nothing when it counts.
I think you're confusing the SCC with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, those guys actually do have an obligation to stand up for one another. But just to be 100% clear, people in the SCC are under no obligation to defend one another in the abstract. Now, I would argue there is an obligation to say things that are true and stand up for those being wrong, albeit I consider that more of a human value as opposed to an SCC one. And even then, I don't really have figures or data to back that up. It's just what I believe would be morally correct. However, somebody being in the SCC does not mean they get stood up for no matter what, regardless of the context. And neither does Hiten, given she criticized people like Keyblade Master and Tippy during the Cloak and Dagger situation. Rightfully so, for the record. I completely agree with her that those two were utterly abhorrent.
Listen, maybe it's my autism, but when I say a thing, that's usually the only thing I mean by it. If I make a comment that I thought the sky was blue, I don't secretly mean that it's only blue on Tuesdays at 4:20 p.m. when the sun's out.
You know, in that example, you're saying something completely wrong then, right? The sky isn't perpetually blue 24/7. Here is a picture of the sunrise I found through Google Images. Notice the distinct lack of blue. Instead, you'll see a lot of reds, oranges, and yellows. Here's a picture of the night sky. Notice that it is black and you can see some white stars and a little bit of yellow at the bottom. But where exactly is the blue, Hiten? I can't find it because it doesn't exist.
Finally, I want to get into the straw that broke the camel's back. So Dalsmic was in contact with V Omega from as far back as 2022. I don't blame you if that's the first time you're hearing about it. Because I only heard about it third hand through a friend. Not only that, but V openly admitted to sexually talking with a minor to Doll, who then told nobody. The whole situation was fumbled by the wider community. Namely, Ephrom hadn't been handling things. So for those of you who don't know, Ephrom has been self-elected the leader of the SCC courthouse.
I was the owner of the damn server at the time. The fuck do you mean self-elected? Obviously, I was going to be the one in charge, given it was my server at that point. Or do you think I just walked into the server one day and went, "I'm the big kahuna"?
The server made so that conflict can be resolved. I spoke to Fractured Light, one of the members of the courthouse's archive chat. I learned 3 very important things from Light about that chat that absolutely tipped me over the fucking edge.
1. Pepper was being coaxed by Vigelsio to make contact with V, and after this situation with Dalsmik, having this call in the archive room to confirm the things that had been said...
The call with Dalsmik was not in the archive room. You know that, right? It wasn't even in Courthouse. It was in a private DM group.
Pepper was not told about Dahl's contact with V. In fact, Light was scolded for telling Pepper in the first place.
Your own damn screenshot debunks that. Light specifically said he was scolded for telling Edwin, formerly known as Pepper, what happened without my knowledge.
2. Pokesonic's groomer, Sigma Scott, has a new Snapchat account. Pokesonic was informed, not by Ephrom, but once again by Light, who had to break the rules of the chat. So she was not told that her groomer was active again.
Again, Light was far from certain about it. You'd actually realize that if you read the damn messages you put on screen. Also, was Kame informed or weren't they? You contradict that in this very fucking sentence.
3rd, and finally, this room, where all of these backroom dealings, dealing with predators and abusive people in the community, that room, nobody knew that it existed. It was not public knowledge until after I left Courthouse.
So let's ignore the fact that you don't actually give us any time frame for when you left Courthouse, meaning that statement doesn't really communicate anything. How long had the archive room existed by that point? And furthermore, why wasn't it known to the public? I'm just going to say right now that I personally never attempted to keep the archive room a secret. And this is also what Light says. His exact words are, admittedly, I'd assumed everyone already knew about it, 'cause I did tell a few people like Erb, Liquid, and I think Emo about it.
This information was so closely guarded that the people in the server that the chat was housed in did not know it existed.
It wasn't closely guarded. That's just not a thing that was told to you in any way whatsoever, Hiten. Going back to what Light actually fucking said, the problem was less that this information was kept away from the community and more that we perpetually underestimated how far said information was being spread. As the person who led the archive room, I can testify that was actually a rather massive problem. That's not even my only problem with this, by the way, because you remember how earlier Hiten got onto me for asking Light to let me know before they gave information found in the archive room to others? Yeah, one of the major reasons why that restriction was put in place is because as the leader, I do actually need to know what the general community knows before I can make decisions regarding serious matters.
Namely, the server built to discuss dangers and conflict within the community. This is absolutely ridiculous, wildly inept behavior, and I cannot fucking believe the audacity to keep important information from victims and to keep the community in the dark about people that are active threats to its members.
Neither Dull nor Sigma Scott were active threats to the SCC by that point, though. What in the ever-loving fuck are you going on about? Were they actively still engaging in their behaviors at the time among SCC members? Because, to my knowledge, Sigma Scott was not even really involved with SCC spaces starting years before the information about him being a predator came out. Similarly, if memory serves, although Dull had done abhorrent things years ago, trust me, I did an entire video blasting him. I know what his behavior was. But he wasn't actively engaging in that behavior at that time, to my knowledge at least. And even if he was, it's not like he was even in the fucking community anymore. He left after Cloak and Dagger. Also, I've been trying to ignore just giving my side of the story for basically the entire commentary, because genuinely, that's not really what's important. What matters is what I can prove, not what I say happened. However, I do want to take a moment and just mention real quick. You guys want to know why I was keeping people in the dark regarding Dahl? Because I was worried that he'd catch wind of the general dislike towards him from the community at the time, again, in my opinion, rightfully so, get scared and run. If that happened, we'd have never known about the Binary Storks account, nor would we know the sheer extent that Dahl was aware what V was doing. Nor would we have any of the information we got in those screenshots of the DMs between Dahl and V. To put it as bluntly as possible, there was no way in fuck I was going to let that happen. Now, did I always make the best choices during that situation? Obviously not. Nobody is going to exclusively make the best choices in any situation where there are so many choices to make. And I have no doubt that reasonable people could engage in honest, genuine criticism of some of my actions during that situation as a whole. However, Hiten is just ignoring the context for these decisions, and that is genuinely one of the most frustrating aspects of this entire video.
Ephrom also said that he would make a video to inform people about Scott, much like the video he just made to inform people about Dalsmik.
Really? I did? Do you have any evidence of this at all?
It's been 3 weeks. Ephrom has put out 5 other videos since then, one of them a 50-minute long video on Razor Fist.
Yeah, I decided to cover a video of Razor Fist that had over 600,000 views at the time of my commentary and was saying utterly nonsensical statements about an incredibly important historical event. Funny you don't phrase it like that. Also, really weird how you don't have any evidence I even proposed doing this in the first place, but now you apparently have a specific date, or at the very least a general time frame as to when I did.
Good to see where your priorities lie. What this whole thing boils down to is that I'm too fucking exhausted and irate with this community
to re-record that line.
I'm done losing hair, I'm done losing sleep, I'm done losing joy for a community that has done nothing but show me time and time again that I'm just gonna be a punching bag for trying to help.
How the fuck does that relate to this? Genuinely, Hiten had absolutely no involvement to my knowledge in any of the situations they have specifically talked about in this video. What the fuck do they mean they were treated like a punching bag? Where did that come from? My final thoughts are that this video was absolutely horrendous in so many ways. Good night and good luck. He did another one of these? Okay, I guess I'll give it a look. The first thing I want to note in this video is Jar admits to having previously lied on 2 separate occasions. Now, one of these is about something related to Jar's mental health, and I'm not going to get on to him for lying about that, because I imagine it's a difficult thing to mention publicly. The other of these, however, I am not so nice to, and that's when Jar says this.
A few people have pointed out that at the start of the city draft that I uploaded, I claimed that I went through the dock. That was a lie. It wouldn't have been a lie if that draft didn't get leaked, but I have that recorded because I was going to go through the dock with my roommate before I decided to upload that draft or not.
I just bluntly don't understand the logic here, if only because Jar still misrepresented how knowledgeable he was on the situation to those who watched the original video. There's also him speculating about Kumo's motivations at one point. I have absolutely no idea what relevance this is supposed to serve.
When I interviewed Cindy, I wanted to make it seem like I was on her side as much as possible so she wouldn't run away. I want to make this clear, I wasn't pulling an op on her or anything like that. I was just trying to make sure my information was correct.
As seen by this screenshot, where literally nothing of the sort is so much as brought up, I have no idea why Jar put this on screen.
As you can hear clear as crystal, I was emphasizing to Vincent Skullman that my video's purpose was not to convince people that Cindy was innocent, just less guilty.
What do you mean by less guilty? Either she did it or she didn't do it. There's no only being a certain percent of predator. And by the way, Jar, in your original video on Cine, the one that was uploaded to your channel, you directly said there were a bunch of things you didn't believe Cine to be guilty of.
But I do not think that Cindy is a groomer, a pedo, a child predator, or anything like that.
Fuck, you even say later in this video that you yourself were not sure at the time if Cine was guilty of predation.
I was also iffy at this point in time whether what Cindy did was grooming or not.
But then you were directly arguing that she wasn't guilty of predation. So why are you trying to say that you were just trying to make her sound less guilty, as if that's even really a coherent concept in this situation? Or were you actually trying to investigate if she was in Kramer versus Predator and just got really confused along the way?
You want him back? You can't just disappear for 3 months and then suddenly decide you want him back! You can't have him! Now, if you don't believe me that I wouldn't have uploaded this video if Kumo didn't do what he did, why is it that the first time I ever receive massive backlash is the same time a draft of my video is leaked? If you think it's just a coincidence, then stars aligned. That's quite a coincidence.
What does that have to do with anything? How are those two concepts even slightly related? What the fuck are you going on about, Jar? Anyway, then there's more speculation about Kumo's true motives. Jar offers no evidence for his interpretation of these events whatsoever, and even if this were true, it has absolutely nothing to do with the topics at hand. By the way, I've been skipping a lot more than normal, primarily because this video is so devoid of substance. A lot of it is just unsupported claims without any sort of evidence, or Jar discussing the Cine situation while promising us he would have totally made a good video if only Kumo hadn't leaked that draft.
Choco made the claim that she had a perfect memory from a call that happened over 4 years ago. Gotta admit, that's pretty impressive. I struggle to remember a call I had with Vincent Skullman just a couple of weeks ago.
You do know that people can remember things from years ago, right? Even if you yourself have a bad memory, there are people with better memories than you. What if this person had hyperthymesia, a condition that allows somebody to remember essentially every single detail in their life?
Choco did show evidence that I got her to draw Jade animations lifting up her shirt when she was 17 and a half. I do not know how you go from requesting rape porn to ending up with a picture that could fit in a thumbnail.
You show a part of the document in this video which specifically says you started backpedaling after people began to freak out about that request in the call you were in.
After Choco released her doc on me, she blocked me, and I do not know why.
Because she had just made a document public which accused you of decently serious misconduct?
I understand that I talk funny and say things in a very bizarre way. Don't lie to yourself. When you hear me talk, the only thing you can think of is how I'm an easy target. You think I don't know? I get it. It's funny to mock someone like me. And it's smart to paint me as much as an awful person as you can, so your hatred for me seems justifiable. Plenty of people couldn't wait for my downfall. They just lacked a reason, and now they have it.
Or a lot of people just thought you were wrong. That's also a possibility. Anyway, my final thoughts are I essentially covered a 30-minute video in 6 minutes, and that really says everything you need to know about Jar's video. Good night, and good luck. Before I begin this commentary, I just want to be clear that despite being an atheist and a frequent critic of Christianity, that doesn't mean those who fall into those same boxes in this case specifically the second one, are going to be free from my criticism. The laws of rationality apply universally, after all. Armored Skeptic did a video recently on the question on if Jesus is real, and full disclosure, again, despite my atheism, I do believe some sort of historical Jesus existed. Albeit, I also don't think the Bible was an accurate representation of his life. And this is essentially the position that Skeptic pronounces in this video.
I still believe that Jesus probably was a real person, but I now believe that the Gospels were not designed to represent that man properly.
However, our disagreement comes about regarding why exactly the Gospels are not a good account for the life of Jesus. You see, Skeptic takes the Caesar's Messiah view. And that's not me strawmanning him or putting words in his mouth. He actually recommends his audience watch the documentary Caesar's Messiah if they want to understand more information regarding the topic he's discussing.
I highly recommend that you watch Caesar's Messiah, the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus, to get more information on this. Actually, just check out their YouTube channel because they have a bunch of different videos that sort of lay this out a little bit better than I do here.
For those unaware, the movie Caesar's Messiah is based off a book by the same name, written by a man named Joseph Atwill. Again, not putting words in anybody's mouth, that is literally something the film directly says in its closing credits. The problem is, Joseph Atwill is not considered a reliable source of information among those who have the credentials required to be seen as experts on the topic. In fact, to my knowledge, basically everyone who has such credentials and has talked about Atwill has specifically said not to take his work seriously. Robert Price and Richard Carrier, the only two people who are scholars of relevant fields that also belong to the idea of mythicism, to my knowledge at least, which is essentially the belief that there was no historical Jesus at all, or if there was one, it was so far removed from the Bible's depiction of him that we can't really get any information about him today, have both written long critiques of Atwill's work, noting several historical inaccuracies. Side note on a related topic, early on in the video, Skeptic says,
"Did Jesus really exist? This is one of the most debated topics of all time."
Even if one accepts the mythicist idea, which again I do not, the claim that it's highly debated is just inaccurate. Bart Ehrman notes how the first author to actually claim full-blown mythicism regarding Jesus did so in 1791. And since then, he goes on to point out, most of the people who advocate for it have been on the fringes, and very few of them have been genuine scholars on relevant topics. Which Skeptic ends up saying later in this very video anyway.
Even as an atheist, I always assumed that Jesus was a real person. There have been plenty of secular and non-Christian Bible scholars and historians throughout time who have all agreed that Jesus was a real man. And even when they were skeptical about Jesus, they weren't questioning whether or not he was real. They were critical of things more like whether or not he could perform miracles or if he was the Son of God.
Again, the only two, to my knowledge, who fall under that category of scholars who believe this are Price and Carrier, and Skeptic directly mentions having read Carrier's work previously.
The first time I had ever actually seriously considered whether or not Jesus was real would have been in the 2010s, when I came across Dr. Richard Carrier's work on the historicity of Jesus.
The movie in general is just filled with a who's who of pseudo-historians, by the way. I immediately took note of the appearances of D.M. Murdoch and Timothy Freck because I was familiar with these names due to their prominence among pseudo-historians of the ancient world. Regarding Murdoch, Ehrman said of her book The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold, "Mythicists of this ilk should not be surprised that their views are not taken seriously by real scholars, that their books are not reviewed in scholarly journals, mentioned by experts in the field, or even read by them. The book is filled with so many factual errors and outlandish assertions that it is hard to believe that the author is serious. If she is serious, it is hard to believe that she has ever encountered anything resembling historical scholarship. Her research appears to have involved reading a number of non-scholarly books that say the same thing she is about to say and then quoting them. One looks in vain for the citation of a primary ancient source and quotations from real experts. Elaine Pagel's, chiefly, are ripped from their context and misconstrued. Still, in opposition to scholars who take alternative positions, such as that Jesus existed, she calls them historicizers. Acharya states, if we assume that the historicizers' disregard of these scholars, that is, the mythicists, is deliberate, we can only conclude that is because the mythicists' argument have been too intelligent and knife-like to do away with. One cannot help wondering if this is all a spoof done in good humor. In short, if there is any conspiracy here, it is not on the part of the ancient Christians who made up Jesus, but on the part of modern authors who made up stories about the ancient Christians and what they believed about Jesus. Regarding Freck, Ehrman is similarly very critical of his work, saying the following about a book of his called The Jesus Mysteries: was the original Jesus a pagan god, written along with Peter Gandy. Real historians of antiquity are scandalized by such assertions, or they would be if they bothered to read Freck and Gandy's book. The authors provide no evidence for their claims concerning the standard mythology of the god-men. They cite no sources from the ancient world that can be checked. It is not that they have provided an alternative interpretation of the available evidence, they have not even cited the available evidence, and for good reason, no such evidence exists. What, for example, is the proof that Osiris was born on December 25th before 3 shepherds, or that he was crucified, and that his death brought atonement for sin, or that he returned to life on earth by being raised from the dead? In fact, no ancient source says any such thing about Osiris or about the other gods, but Freck and Gandy claim that this is common knowledge, and they prove it by quoting other writers from the 19th and 20th centuries who said so. But these writers too do not cite any historical evidence. This is all based on assertion, believed by Freck and Gandy simply because they read it somewhere. This is not serious historical scholarship, it is sensationalist writing driven by a desire to sell books. Now, there's a lot that could be said about this documentary. In fact, it might even get its own video one day if anybody is interested. However, I'm going to stick to its central thesis because that's also what Skeptic says in the video I'm commentating on. Essentially, according to both the documentary and Armored Skeptic, the Flavians, the ruling family of Rome in the latter part of the 1st century, made up Christianity whole cloth in hopes of pacifying the Jewish Messiah movement, which was threatening their control over Judea.
The Roman effort to forge a new religion around the Messiah, around this Jesus character, was authored by a specific ruling family in Rome, the Flavians. The Flavians created Christianity to pacify the Messianic movement, to turn them into a benign, harmless movement, and as part of their effort to bring the Abrahamic faith under the control of the Roman Empire.
For Joseph Atwill, the key was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only Jewish literature ever discovered from the 1st century AD or CE, the time that Jesus would have been preaching among the Jews.
The characters in the Dead Sea Scrolls were militaristic, and you could see that this movement wanted to push the foreigners out of Israel. They were fundamentalists, whereas the characters in the Gospel are different. They are pacifistic. They are turning the other cheek. They're giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. How did a movement like Christianity come to exist in a region that was occupied by Roman soldiers and had Jewish zealots within it that were going to push these Romans out? How was that possible?
My efforts to understand these connections led me to an incredible discovery. Christianity had been invented by a little-known family of Roman Caesars, the Flavians.
Never mind that Nero was somehow able to blame Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, which happened in the year 64, 5 years before the Flavians took power. Also, if the Flavians really created Christianity specifically in hopes of bringing Judaism under the control of the Roman Empire, then why was only one of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, specifically written for a Jewish audience? And that was written after the Gospel of Mark, by the way, so it's not even the oldest of the 4. And by the way, why is that gospel the one with far more anti-Roman sentiment in it than the Gospel of Luke, which was written for Gentiles or non-Jews? Non-Stamp Collector has a video going into this, but essentially the Gospel of Luke changed many details from the stories present in Mark, specifically in ways that made Rome appear far more sympathetic. It is in Luke, for example, where Pontius Pilate, the judge who sentenced Jesus to crucifixion, gets the most sympathetic treatment. Here's a clip of said video regarding this particular topic.
What about that sadist Pilate? He has Jesus flogged even though he can't find a reason to.
Well, leave that out too.
But it happened.
That doesn't mean you have to mention it. Just because something isn't mentioned doesn't mean that you're saying it didn't happen.
Yeah, but hold on.
And it works both ways too, if you think about it. Did the Gospel author mention anything about how Pilate tried really hard to get Jesus off the hook and kept insisting again and again that he thought Jesus was innocent and oughtn't be killed?
What? There's nothing in the Gospel about that.
Yeah, well, see, that's what I'm saying. He appears to have left that out. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, so you could include that.
Hang on, so you want to insert something new and simply claim that the original author decided to leave it out? That's not how it works, man.
Sure it is, man. You're writing up a new copy. You can put whatever you want. Focus the blame away from Rome and more on the Jewish chief priests and leaders. Emphasize harder that they were pushing for Jesus to be killed, and it wouldn't be hard to make it look like Pilate was actually on Jesus' side.
I'll put the relevant passages on screen right now. However, in Mark, it's obvious that Pilate is treated, at nicest, as an uncaring bureaucrat who doesn't really think too much about these situations, while in Luke, he's actively confused as to why people want Jesus dead, but feels his hands are tied. If only because the crowd is demanding this man be crucified. Side note, Skeptic also proposes that the Flavians are the authors of the Gospels.
There's really good evidence that the Gospels were authored by the Flavian family. I'm not just making this up.
But I think I just showed one of the bigger problems with that idea. If the Gospels were really written by a centralized group of people with a clear agenda, why are so many of the stories told from different perspectives? Wouldn't a dogma coming out of a centralized source inherently want uniformity in their belief system and not differences which could cause confusion among the masses? I also want to note that allegedly Josephus was in on this grand conspiracy, specifically being asked by the Flavian family to rewrite the history of Judea in order to lay the groundwork for the Christian narrative.
Josephus was given the specific mandate by the Flavian family to rewrite the history of Judea and to lay the groundwork for the official narrative of Christianity.
However, this entire notion of Josephus having involvement falls apart when you realize who Josephus was and what the New Testament was. For those unaware, Josephus was one of the greatest scholars of Judaism in his day, even authoring a 20-volume work called Antiquity of the Jews, which goes over the history of said group of people. However, the New Testament actually shows a rather sloppy understanding of Jewish history and cultural traditions, making it unlikely such a document would have anything to do with as highly educated of a man as Josephus. Bart Ehrman even documents one particular error in his book Misquoting Jesus, that scribes had to correct at the time because of its presence in original copies of the document. Sometimes scribes changed their text because they thought the text contained a factual error. This appears to be the case at the very beginning of Mark, where the author introduces his gospel by saying, "Just as is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I am sending a messenger before your face, make straight his paths." The problem is the beginning of the quotation is not from Isaiah at all, but represents a combination of a passage from Exodus 23:20 and one from Malachi 3:1. Scribes recognized that this was a difficulty and so changed the text, making it say, "just as is written in the prophets." Now, there is no problem with a misattribution of the quotation, but there can be little doubt concerning what Mark originally wrote. The attribution to Isaiah is found in our earliest and best manuscripts. For another example, notice how in the Synoptic Gospels, those being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper, which is a Passover Seder, actually happens on a Thursday, even though it's held on a Friday in Judaism and has been that way throughout all of history. This is a detail John changes, by the way. But now that I've gone over why the central thesis is nonsense, let's start picking at some other stuff.
Regardless of who Jesus really was, and regardless of the true purpose of what the Messiah was supposed to be, the New Testament was written by the Romans decades after Jesus would have passed away.
So I'm going to pull another rug out from under my audience and say real quick that we don't actually know for sure who wrote the Gospels. Although they are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, many scholars today believe these to be placeholder names for works that were written entirely anonymously. Similar issues exist with trying to determine who wrote the Book of Revelation. Although it has historically been attributed to John the Disciple, most modern scholars and commentators refer to this person as John the Revelator, and confess a total inability to be sure exactly who this individual is. But Skeptic is trying to propose this conspiracy based off of information that, to be absolutely blunt, we don't actually have. Furthermore, there wasn't even an agreed upon definition on what counted as the New Testament until the Council of Trent in the 16th century, albeit there had been an informal agreement on the topic going as far back as the Council of Nicaea. We also see a massive amount of diversity within early Christianity, including on topics that these days are considered essential Christian doctrines. For example, Christianity was not always universally monotheistic. To quote from Bart Ehrman again, "In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were, of course, Christians who believed that there was only one God, the creator of all there is. Other people who called themselves Christian, however, insisted that there were two different gods, one of the Old Testament, a God of wrath, and one of the New Testament, a God of love and mercy. These were not simply two different facets of the same God. They were actually two different gods. Strikingly, the group that made these claims, including the followers of Marcion, whom we have already met, insisted that their views were the true teachings of Jesus and his apostles. Other groups, for example, of Gnostic Christians, insisted that there were not just two gods, but 12. Others said 30. Others still said 365. All these groups claimed to be Christian, insisting that their views were true and had been taught by Jesus and his followers. Why didn't these other groups simply read their New Testament to see that their views were wrong? It is because there was no New Testament. To be sure, all the books of the New Testament had been written by this time, but there were lots of other books as well, also claiming to be by Jesus' own apostles, other Gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypses having very different perspectives from those found in the books that eventually came to be called the New Testament. The New Testament itself emerged out of these conflicts over God, or the gods, as one group of believers acquired more converts than all the others and decided which books should be included in the canon of Scripture. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, there was no agreed upon canon and no agreed upon theology. Instead, there was a wide range of diversity, diverse groups asserting diverse theologies based on diverse written texts, all claiming to be written by apostles of Jesus.
Using a perfectly moral character like Jesus as a mouthpiece for the values of the Roman Empire, for example, would be a very powerful way to create a perception about their power structure.
But that's not a thing that actually happened. If anything, Christianity was greatly opposed to the values of the Roman Empire. In particular, Christianity's refusal to accept the beliefs of other faiths inherently put it at odds with the Roman idea of theology, which was inclusive in nature.
It was really common for Roman emperors to declare themselves God.
No, they were usually declared such by others after their deaths.
So after the Flavians took control of Rome after Nero, they wanted a way to make their rulership appear especially divine. They wanted their rulership to appear divine not within just the context of the Roman Empire, but within all the provinces and all the cultures in all the provinces across the empire. So the Flavians used Josephus to create this perception, making it appear as if the Flavians were fulfilling biblical prophecy.
But Josephus had made that prediction the previous year. It wasn't some attempt to manufacture a consensus, it was genuinely his belief on the topic.
The most glaring issue that I see in the Gospels is the way that Pontius Pilate reacted to Jesus turning himself in to be executed. Nothing about that situation seems historically accurate. When Jesus presented himself to Pilate, Pilate told Jesus that he didn't want to execute him. But Jesus insisted on being punished and implored Pilate to ask the people to choose his fate for him. So Pilate asked the population their opinion, and the crowd unanimously cried that they wanted to see Jesus punished. So Pilate reluctantly gave in to the demands of the crowd and had Jesus crucified. That doesn't make any sense at all. See, Rome's control over Judea was extremely fragile at the time, and they were ruling with an iron fist. There were several local factions that were revolting against Rome and fighting against their military. Pontius Pilate would have been looking for any excuse he could find to make an example out of somebody who was causing problems for Roman rule at the time.
I included this clip just to point out that this is after Skeptic says Jesus never said anything to challenge Roman rule over Judea.
What's really strange to me is that Jesus never mentions any of this in the Gospels. Jesus never had anything to say about his people being forced to worship the Caesars as gods. Jesus didn't even mention the presence of Roman statues in the temples at all. You'd assume that the Messiah would be critical of such a thing, or at very least have some advice on how to handle that issue. Yet this is completely absent from the New Testament entirely. Jesus doesn't even really mention Roman occupation at all. Even if Jesus wasn't critical of Roman occupation, he should have at least had some wisdom to share about it.
So what problems exactly do you believe Jesus was creating for the Romans? If anything, wouldn't the Romans be interested in keeping someone like that alive because they could potentially gain popularity within the region and divert Jewish attention away from more actively revolutionary movements?
Someone like Jesus would have been infamous among the Romans for this reason. If Jesus really was as prolific as the Gospels imply, then the Romans would have had their eye on him for a very long time. Pilate would have had every reason to want to get rid of Jesus and to make an example of him.
They would have been very concerned about a guy who wasn't talking about them and spent most of his time fighting with other Jews, I guess. Even though doing so would also weaken the Jewish Messiah movement as a whole through causing such division among Jewish individuals, therefore again giving Rome an actually really good incentive to keep him around and not execute him. You just mentioned before that clip how leaders of the Jewish Messiah movement were regularly executed as rebels.
Because the Messianic movement was especially hostile against the Romans. The Messianic movement fought against the Roman military regularly, and at this time there were several people exactly like Jesus who had declared themselves the Messiah and were considered leaders of this Messianic movement, and Rome executed all of them as rebels.
But it's not as if Rome had some law on the book specifically against leading the Jewish Messianic movement. The reason why those people were executed as rebels were due to them inciting rebellion. For those who don't know, I'll let him describe the Jewish Messianic movement and what its goals usually were outside of Jesus.
And there was a real messianic movement that existed in that time, but they were trying to find a Messiah to help save them from the Romans. The original ancient believers of the Abrahamic faith believed that the Messiah was supposed to drive the Romans out of their land and give Judea back their sovereignty.
But that begs the question of, if somebody was not falling into that category, what reason would Rome even have to execute them?
And also, none of the people of Judea wanted the Romans there, and most of the people of Judea were vividly aware that the Messianic movement was one of their best hopes to get the Romans out of there. So it's way more likely that the general population would have been more sympathetic towards Jesus in this situation.
Unless he wasn't actually condemning Rome, at which point there'd be no reason for them to assume he would take up fight against the Romans. This video keeps contradicting itself regarding who Jesus was, framing him as both a revolutionary anti-Roman figure in the mind of Judea, while also claiming he was not critical of the Roman Empire and therefore was a Roman plant, who also might not have even existed.
If the people of Judea really hated Rome, why would they ask the Roman emissary, Pilate, to execute someone who is seen as one of their own rebel leaders?
Because he wasn't. You already fucking established that.
Strangely, in the Gospels, Jesus comes across as very pro-Rome in general. Jesus almost completely contradicted the sentiments of the Messianic movement at the time. And when Jesus was critical of power structures, he focused his criticism on the religious leaders of Judea at the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus never actually criticized Rome a single time, yet he was extremely critical of the tradition holders of their culture. Why is Jesus presented this way in the Gospels?
I wish to emphasize, I am not splicing different videos together or anything of the sort. These are all from the exact same video. It constantly asked, why was Jesus so pro-Roman, and then wonders, why were the Romans so lukewarm to somebody who was apparently such a massive rebellion figure, without realizing that doesn't make any fucking sense. And I know I keep emphasizing this. I know I keep going on about this particular topic. However, there are just so many examples of it put together with how both are used as smoking guns for different aspects of the narrative Skeptic is trying to push.
This is how we end up with a Messiah that's a pacifist, that taught his followers to turn the other cheek, to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. This is how you end up with a Messiah that was happy to be turned into the Romans to be executed, and even insisted on being punished.
You do know early Christians were far from universally pacifistic, right?
The Flavian named Vespasia was appointed emperor of Rome, and naturally, he declared himself God.
No, he made a joke about that in 79 AD while he was dying of illness.
The parallels between Jesus in the Gospels and the military campaign of Titus begin in Galilee. In Galilee, Jesus meets some of his disciples for the first time while they're on a boat trying to catch fish. Jesus tells these men that if they choose to follow him, if they choose to become his disciples, then he will make them fishers of men. or catchers of men. Well, that event is based on the beginning of Titus's military campaign against Judea. The historian Josephus explains that at the beginning of his military campaign, Titus went to Galilee and told his military to go out into the water and destroy all of the fishing boats and capture all of the fishermen. All of the fishermen tried to flee from the Roman military, many of them even jumping into the water to try to swim away. But Titus's military chased them all down, capturing all of them, including the people who were in the water trying to swim away. So at the beginning of Titus's story, in Galilee, Titus's military were literally fishers of men.
I mean, if you ignore the fact those aren't even remotely the same things outside of the most superficial mentions of similar topics, then I guess that's a valid point. Good night and good luck.